Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? We have no questions this week, so we can start right into the book. Now, you all are working off of a PDF file that goes, I think, through page 31. And we are on the bottom of page 30 right now. So today, if we finish page 31, you will need a new PDF. I spoke to Olavo a couple of days ago and asked him whether he wanted to continue with this book or change to something else, and he said to continue with this book. So if that's okay with you, then Olavo will duplicate some more pages and put them up on the website for you to download. And hopefully we will finish this PDF today, and then next week we'll be into the next one. So let's see if we can do that. By the way, I spent a couple of hours discussing the material of the next few pages with Olavo, actually really the next 2 pages, just 2 pages, and he gave me 10 pages of notes about it. So Olavo feels this material is very rich and pregnant, to use a word we used last week. So I'll try to weave his ideas into the discussion as the ideas occur to me when we are reading. Okay? So let us look at page 30. The paragraph that we finished with last time was in the middle of the page. It was the first full paragraph, beginning with the words Marjorie Greene's chapter. And as you know, in this paragraph, Levis gave his opinion of the Marjorie Greene chapter 6 of her book, and he said that it was a really good book, especially a very good chapter for students to read. So then he goes into a quote from the opening of the chapter, and that's where we will begin today. I will read beginning with the words, "Nor is it Kant." Okay? Page 30. Nor is it Kant alone who insists on such a separation between the questions of knowing, doing, and believing. Kant was echoing in this one fundamental consequence of the Cartesian Newtonian worldview. The dualism of matter and mind entails a dualism of the external objective and the internal subjective. There is the world spread out through space, independent of my feelings, ideas, or volitions. And there are my secret thoughts, the modes of my consciousness. The purity of science, moreover, is thought to depend on the extrusion of the second from the first. In Kant, this dichotomy is represented, for example, by the distinction between an outer and an inner sense. In contemporary philosophy, with its emphasis on language, it becomes the distinction between statements of fact and statements of value. Again, the purity of science is held to depend on keeping the former uncontaminated by the latter. Okay, let's take that much for now. Okay, the first word, nor. This indicates to me that Levis has picked up the quote in progress. This is not the beginning of the thought. In English, we have either or, and we have neither nor. So either or is positive. Either pizza or ice cream is a child's favorite food. Neither pizza nor ice cream is a child's favorite food. So in this case, pizza or ice cream are the beloved foods. But in this case, pizza and ice cream are not favorites. No kid likes those. So this is the negative, this is the positive. If this sentence begins, nor is it Kant alone, there must have been an implied neither before that in the thought. So there must have been some thought that had a negative flavor, and then we pick up with nor is it Kant alone who insists on such a separation. So the nor implies that this is the second half, at least, of an argument in progress. But we don't know what that argument is because we don't have the full text of the chapter. Okay, nor is it Kant alone. Nor means it is not Kant alone. So, it is not Kant alone who insists on such a separation. Now, in brackets like this, between the questions of knowing, doing, and believing, that insert was put in by Levis to add clarity to the quote which was in progress. The fact of these brackets indicates to the reader that this portion of writing was not part of the initial quote. It was inserted, put in for clarification by Levis. Okay? So, nor is it Kant alone who insists on such a separation. Kant alone who insists. We had nor is it Kant alone. Okay, Kant alone means only Kant and nobody else. So, previously I said it meant it is not Kant, nor is it Kant would mean it is not Kant. But that's not exactly true. It is not Kant alone, which means it is not only Kant, which basically in literal language means more people than just Kant do this. So this phrase, nor is it Kant alone who insists on such a separation, means, nor is it Kant alone, means, see if we can see with this color. There are others, other people, besides Kant. Besides means in addition to Kant. Okay? It is not only Kant. It is not only Kant, but it is other people too. Okay? So this phrase, nor is it Kant alone who insists on such a separation, means other people insist also. Insist means to assert strongly, to believe and speak and say something strongly. So he insists on such a separation. Such a means a separation like this. Like what? Like the separation between the questions of knowing, doing, and believing. Okay, so such a means like this. So we could rewrite this phrase, the whole phrase, literally, in plain speech. In plain speech, this phrase means there are other people in addition to Kant who insist on a separation. And now we'll put in this thing for clarification. So between the questions of knowing, doing, and believing. Between the questions of knowing, doing, and believing. That's the literal meaning of that first sentence, that first phrase of the sentence. And apparently, the discussion probably was about the distinction between knowing, doing, and believing. Different types of actions and substance, perhaps. Olavo said that Descartes taught about different kinds of substance, material substance and immaterial thinking substance, knowing and doing and believing. And Olavo said that ideas are a form of doing. So, Alessandro and I have been discussing what he meant by that, not completely sure, except to think that ideas are something we create in our mind. It's something we do, as opposed to kind of like they don't have existence. Well, Olavo says ideas are not substance, they are action. So, anyway, okay. Nor is it Kant alone who insists on a separation between the questions of knowing, doing, and believing. What's the difference between knowing and believing? Knowing and believing. Knowing has more of a factual connotation. Factual. You know it for sure. Believing has more of an idea of faith without sight. We do not have to believe that which we know. If we know it, we do not have to put faith in it. But if we believe something, we know it without the same kind of concrete evidence. So that's the difference in English between knowing something and believing something. And people consider that believing is much more likely to be in error, much more fallible. Okay. So, there are other people in addition to Kant who insist on a separation between the questions of knowing, doing, and believing. Kant was echoing. Kant was echoing. Kant was echoing. An echo is a reflection of sound. So if Kant is echoing, that means someone else said it first. He heard it and repeated it. He echoed, and an echo generally comes back many times. Does echo come from a Latin root? Okay. So, Kant was echoing. He's not the only one. Other people say it. Kant echoed it. In this one and fundamental consequence of the Cartesian Newtonian worldview. Okay, the separation is one and one fundamental. So it's a foundational, very important consequence of the Cartesian Newtonian worldview. One thing that Olavo told me about and you all may have heard him speak on this, so it may be completely familiar to you. But he spoke of the 16th and 17th century scientists: Bacon, Newton, Galileo, Descartes. Bacon, Newton, Galileo, Descartes. 16th and 17th centuries. And he said that these people originated a new view for science, the scientific worldview. Which has been standard and normative for the last 300 years. Universally, this worldview was originated around this time by these scientists, and people have relied upon it ever since. And one aspect of this worldview was a distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. The primary qualities were said to be those which could be measured, measurable. The secondary qualities were said to be subjective. Impossible to measure. Primary qualities were things like weight and length well, that sort of thing. Weight, something that can be measured with an instrument. Secondary qualities included color, taste, which were considered to be subjective and immeasurable. And the secondary qualities were held to be of less importance because they couldn't be measured. Only the primary qualities came under the purview of science. And Olavo said that this kind of thinking was exactly upside down, because what was held to be primary was something that had to be measured against a standard which had to be created by man. Yet what was considered secondary were qualities which could be directly experienced by man. So Olavo said that these things should have been primary, that which we can experience directly. We can have eyewitness data. We can feel it, taste it, touch it, smell it, see it, and recognize it. That is what makes a thing what it is to us. These secondary qualities of whether it's 1 meter long or 30 inches long, or whether it weighs a kilo, or whether it weighs a pound, or whether it's straight like a ruler or curved, these kind of qualities should have been called secondary because they cannot be directly experienced by the common man. Yet, these things were held to be unimportant, almost illusory, almost as though they didn't exist. They were functions of our mind, imaginations almost, whereas these were held to be objective, concrete, stay the same from one day to the next, the same for all people. And ultimately, this dualism gave birth to a whole dualistic worldview in which science denied the existence of anything that could not be measured, including what Olavo called intelligible form. Intelligible form. If you see a cat, you know it is a cat. From a scientific perspective, a cat and another animal, maybe a dog of the same size, might have similar primary qualities. They might weigh the same. They might have the same length from nose to tail. They may be similar, but when you look at them, you know this is a cat and this is a dog. Perhaps you will have this cat and another cat which is much bigger, weighs 3 times as much and is huge. Yet you would still say this is a cat and that is a cat, and this thing is a dog. You recognize something which makes this a cat, and that ugly creature that may be enormous and malformed is also a cat, and this beautiful animal here that is of the same size is a dog. There is a concept of cat in your mind. The scientific worldview denied that, and they said that, again, this is just subjective. So this has a lot of ramifications for philosophy, and all of modern philosophy is informed by this dualism. And it's called in this book the Cartesian Newtonian worldview. Cartesian Newtonian worldview. It's the scientific worldview. And it's dualistic between matter and, you could say, thought. Okay, so in the book it says, Kant was echoing in this one fundamental consequence of the Cartesian Newtonian worldview. And the consequence is the insistence on the separation between the questions of knowing, doing, and believing. That is the consequence of the worldview. The idea that these things are separate. The dualism of matter and mind entails a dualism of the external objective and the internal subjective. Entails. What does that mean? Entails. It means contains or implies. So, the dualism of matter and mind contains or implies the dualism of the external objective and the internal subjective. Okay, so those two dualisms are implied by one another. External is correlated to objective. External to the person, objective, part of matter. Internal exists in our head, and it is considered subjective and not grasped by science. Okay. There is the world spread out through space, independent of my feelings, ideas, or volitions. And there are my secret thoughts and modes of my consciousness. This entire sentence is an illustration and a reiteration of the former sentence, the sentence that came before. The sentence that came before talked about the dualism of matter and mind. Matter and mind. It also talked about the dualism of external, objective, and internal, subjective. And then when it says, the next whole sentence is just enlightening this further. There is the world spread out through space, independent of my feelings, ideas, or volitions. Spread out. If I have a piece of toast, bread in the morning that I cook and toast it, and then I take some butter, and I want to spread it out so that there's butter in every bite. I want to spread the butter all the way to the edges of the toast. I want to spread it out. So, the world spread out through space. The world is, it's not just meaning planet Earth. It means the material universe, which is spread out to the external limits of space, all the way to the edges, in all directions. There is the material, existential world, which is independent of my feelings. In other words, if I'm not here, the world is just the same. The world is not affected by how I feel about it, what I think about it, what I intend to do, my volitions, my plans. Everything internal to me has no effect whatsoever on the existence of this world spread out. I am reminded of a sentence in a book I read speaking of the church. And it said, the writer said, I have a vision of the church spread out through time, as terrible as an army with banners. I'm reminded of that. So there is the world spread out through space, independent of me. It'll be just the same, no matter what I do or think. And then there are my secret thoughts, the modes of my consciousness. The modes of my consciousness is a phrase describing my inner reality. It just simply describes everything, the whole set of possible emotions and experiences that I might experience. Those are the modes of my consciousness. Secret thoughts, modes of consciousness. So that's over here. My ideas. Thoughts, volitions, whatever. And that exists, but only in me. Okay. The purity of science, moreover, is thought to depend on the extrusion of the second from the first. Extrusion. Means to put out. Take it out and get rid of it. Make sure the second, this one, is not a part of this. It's just take it away and move it far away. So, the purity of science is said to depend upon the extrusion of this from this. In other words, science cannot be pure and uncontaminated and good and trustworthy if any of this subjective stuff is part of it at all. Only this is the purview of science. All of this must be kept at a distance. The word moreover, that's one word. I made a space there by mistake. Moreover. This word is used to mean in addition to, but it's a matter of ideas. There was a sentence that gave the idea that we had this dualism. And then there was another sentence that explained the dualism. And then it said, in addition to that, the purity of science depends on the extrusion of this. So the moreover shows that it's the structure of the paragraph. We had point A, point B, and moreover, point C. Okay, so it's kind of like showing you the outline. So it means that what follows supports the same idea as what came before. Okay? So, the purity of science, moreover, is thought to depend on the extrusion of the second from the first. Is thought to depend. Why don't they just say the purity of science depends? Well, think who is writing. Marjorie Green is writing. Does she agree with this? No. She is explaining a worldview that she disagrees with. So she's saying, they postulated a dualism, and they peopled the dualism with categories, and they thought one had to be extruded from the other. Okay? So to say, is thought to depend upon, casts some doubt. It means they believe it. They don't know it. Remember the difference between knowing and believing? Knowing is on firm footing. Knowing is factual. Believing is believing in something that you don't have direct evidence for. So when she says, is thought to, she's putting it over in the area of belief. So she is undermining the idea by saying, is thought to depend. They think it depends, but they are wrong, is the implication underneath the surface. Okay? So, the purity of science, moreover, is thought to depend on the extrusion of the second, subjective, from the first, objective stuff. In Kant, this dichotomy is represented, for example, by the distinction between an outer and an inner sense. Okay, so in Kant we've got the outer sense and the inner sense. Kant says that these two kinds of sense or perception are fundamentally different. So, in Kant means in the writings of Kant. Kant's ideas contain the dichotomy between the outer and the inner sense. Sense meaning an intuition. In contemporary philosophy, with its emphasis on language, it becomes the distinction between statements of fact and statements of value. So, Kant has the outer sense and the inner sense, but in contemporary philosophy, which means modern, in our day, modern philosophy, they are more looking at language. So instead of talking about perception, inner sense, outer sense, they're going to speak of what comes out. Statements of fact versus statements of value. Okay. Again, the purity of science is held to depend on keeping the former uncontaminated by the latter. So again, meaning I'm going to restate something that I already said, which is true in this case, as well as in the former case. The purity of science, we just heard that, is held to depend. is held to is replacing the phrase is thought to, and basically it means something very similar. It just means they are holding on to the idea. They are thinking. So it means the same. They are holding on to the idea that the purity of science depends on keeping the former uncontaminated by the latter. Former is first, latter is last. So just keep a memory of the order of what was said before when you see this former, latter in sentences. The former, the latter. In English, you do not have to have both in one sentence. It's not like either or. Sometimes we simply talk about a list of things and then we say the former, like maybe I'll say eggs, butter, and caviar. No, I'll say caviar, butter, and eggs. The former is very expensive, but the latter is cheap. Okay, so the former meaning the thing that came before in the sentence above. It is a shorthand for referring back to something that was said before, meaning the first thing that was said. Latter is the last thing that was said, or later things. Okay. Keeping the former uncontaminated by the latter. Okay. Next paragraph. If there are any questions, just send us an email or a chat at any point. Okay, next paragraph. Perhaps the best known formulation of this dichotomy was that put forward by Ogden and Richards in The Meaning of Meaning, where they distinguished between cognitive and emotive meaning, and correspondingly the statements of science which purvey information were distinguished from the pseudo-statements of poetry or religious discourse. Information, it alleged, is always impersonal, where the person and with him values, preferences, and emotions enter, information withdraws. Allied to this kind of categorization is the conception of value-free science, which has been held to be the norm, not only for the natural sciences, but for the social sciences as well. Here, too, we are often asked to set against the wholly objective statements of science the impassioned utterances of the arts, which are not statements at all. Okay. Perhaps the best known formulation of this dichotomy, okay, that would be the formulation of the dichotomy, the application of the dichotomy that is known by most people, was that put forward by Ogden and Richards. What is put forward? Put forward. Put forward means suggested. Or it could mean originated. Okay? So, the formulation of the dichotomy, the form of the dichotomy, most well known, was the one that was originally suggested by Ogden and Richards in their book entitled The Meaning of Meaning. where they distinguished between cognitive and emotive meaning. And correspondingly, statements of science which purvey information and pseudo-statements of poetry or religious discourse. Okay, so we have cognitive and emotive meaning. Again, we are going to see a devaluing of this one in favor of this one. This one is considered to be important. This one is not considered important at all. Okay, so cognitive and emotive meaning, and correspondingly, which meaning each one will correspond one-to-one, statements of science which purvey information. Purvey means give or put forth information. And pseudo-statements of poetry or religious discourse. Pseudo-statements of poetry or religion, religious discourse. So they're basically saying that the meaning that is purveyed by poetry doesn't really mean anything, doesn't have validity, doesn't really exist. No information comes from pseudo-statements of poetry or religious discourse. Now, poetry, you could imagine, is portraying emotions and feelings. You could almost see that that would not be in the same category as information. But religious discourse, think about Thomas Aquinas, think about creeds. This certainly contains information. To say that the content of religious discourse can't even be called statements, but only pseudo-statements, is incredibly arrogant and condescending. It really is quite mind-boggling that religious discourse could be included in such a contemptuous description, with such a contemptuous description. Okay, so information, it is alleged. Now, at this point, we have it is thought, it is held. Now we have it is alleged. Alleged is weaker even than thought or held. So we had it is thought, it is held, and now we have it is alleged. Is that how you spell it? Yeah. Alleged is a word that is, it means to make a statement of fact, but you might be lying. The statement might be true or it might be false. You're saying it, and someone has to decide, is it true or false? This is used in a court of law when someone wants to cast doubt on another person's testimony, they use this word. They would say, your witness alleges he was at home on the night of the murder, but we have evidence that he was really at the murder scene. So alleged means to make a statement of fact which is extremely suspect. It is probably not true. Okay? So, she is using the term alleged for her sentence. Information, it is alleged, withdraws itself whenever values enter. So she's saying information, it is alleged, is always impersonal. This is considered personal. This is considered impersonal. Now remember what Olavo said about primary and secondary qualities. Primary and secondary qualities. The primary qualities must be measured against a subjective standard. They must be measured against a standard which was created by a person, and that a person does the comparing. So how do we call this impersonal? But information, it is alleged, is impersonal. Always. Always impersonal. Whereas, where persons themselves, persons themselves, I keep doing this, I keep running off the board. Persons themselves, with their values, preferences, and emotions. When they're present, information withdraws. So there is a total disjunction, a total divide between all things personal, people themselves, values, emotions, experiences of directly perceived, like the secondary qualities, you know. All of these are considered to have no information whatsoever. Nothing that is of interest to science. And they can't say anything objective. They can make no statements. Anything they have to say is not even dignified with the title statement. Allied to this kind of categorization is the conception of value-free science. Okay. Allied to this kind of categorization. Allied means be friends with and co-workers for the same goal. Partners in achieving a goal. That's what allies are. So, allied to this kind of a categorization is the whole concept of value-free science. Value-free science, which has been held to be the norm not only for the natural sciences, but for the social sciences as well. Has been held means has been thought to be the norm. Normative means anything other than that is wrong. So it is the norm for the natural sciences, geology, astronomy, physics, but also the social sciences as well, anthropology, sociology, psychology. Value-free sociology, value-free anthropology, value-free psychology. Very interesting. You wonder where they get their standards for their study of psychology in a value-free approach. Standards meaning what you measure against in order to be able to measure something. Okay. Here too, we are often asked to set against the wholly objective statements of science the impassioned utterances of the arts, which are not statements at all. So, here too, in this case as well, we are often asked, so many times we must, set against the wholly objective statements of science. Set against means compare. Compare. Actually, it means contrast. Compare implies looking at two things which are similar. But in this case, we are asked to contrast. That means look at two things which are fundamentally unlike. That is contrast. Tell all the ways they're different. So, when we set something against something, we are contrasting it. So, we are going to contrast the supposedly, allegedly, wholly objective statements of science. Wholly means entirely, and it modifies the word objective. So it is completely objective. Completely objective. I think that's a bit of a laugh, but wholly objective statements of science are to be contrasted with the impassioned utterances. Impassioned utterances of the arts, which are not statements at all.
Margarita.
Yes.
When a student says, could you explain how could this be possible in social sciences? We're not robots, are we?
Right. Okay. Okay, we have had a question, but let me just finish this and then we'll address the question. So we are contrasting completely objective. I think they think they are robots. They think they are computers. They are claiming that no human agenda, no human emotions, preferences, ideas have informed their work at all. They're entirely objective statements of science against the impassioned utterances. So that impassioned really implies hysterical or extremely passionate in such a way as to take your head off, turn off your brain and start screaming. which they clarify are not statements at all of the arts. Okay, so they make a total contrast. Now the question was, how can this be applied to the social sciences? We are not robots. That is a very good comment. It is clear that this is a very inappropriate model for studying humanity. Olavo spoke for a long time about the fact that it stands on its head reality, that that it's completely wrong-headed to think that that which can be measured is the only reality, and that the measurements themselves are the only reality. Olavo said that they are attempting to create, or they are creating, a mathematical world and then saying that is the only real world and nothing else exists. Whereas our senses tell us that we are human bodies, we are living, we are not all the same, we are not robots. And the quality of organic life is not quantifiable in an exclusive sense. So, also, when you talk about social sciences, you have to come up with issues of religion and morality. And this model suggests that those things essentially do not exist. They have no outer existence, no objective reality. They are only creations of people's minds and of collective mind of the community. And so they're just illusions, social constructs. So the social sciences become very descriptive instead of prescriptive. That's actually kind of an important vocabulary distinction if you want to be involved in science, social sciences. Descriptive. Versus prescriptive. In the modern climate, prescriptive approaches are out. They are politically incorrect. You're not allowed to suggest that another culture is wrong for maybe killing twins, babies. If you have two babies, you kill one, you can't say that that's wrong. You can only describe in an article their custom. You can't say that it is bad to perform female circumcision on little girls. Only you can describe the practice. You cannot prescribe that, you can't prescribe anything. However, the liberal left breaks this rule with impunity when it comes to prescribing racial equality and recycling and other liberal causes, pro-abortion, whatever you have of the liberal causes. So this is an orthodoxy that is unbreakable except for those issues which are on the short list for the politically correct movements. So, anyway, values-free science is a sham. It's a sham. Sham. That means it's a joke. It's a lie. It's a deception, I think. Okay, moving on to the next paragraph. It may be deduced from the tone of this that Marjorie Green's book differs fundamentally from the history of Western philosophy of Bertrand Russell, whose basic assumptions about the nature of objectivity confirm the confidence so patent in Andreski that his own need no defense. I mention the history of Western philosophy because I have known experienced and energetic students, men of senior status, attending my seminars, who, having prescribed for themselves a better acquaintance with that background of philosophic thought, which they have realized to be an essential element in literary history, had, they confessed, embarked on a perusal of at least immediately relevant stretches of Russell's large volume. The word confessed registers the fact that they came out with this avowal in response to my telling a group that people in their position hadn't time to discover for themselves how little the energy spent on Russell's history could bring them of the insight, understanding, and stimulus to thought they needed. Of course, as I told my seminars, The Knower and the Known, a much smaller book, gets its coherence, and with this its pregnancy and effective range, by having for its directing and informing spirit the profound conviction expressed in the introduction, the conviction that the Cartesian Newtonian dualism must be exorcised from the Western mind. This, I judge, means that the book will give the literary student the kind of help he needs. Russell's book certainly won't. It is, I have insisted, highly desirable that a department of philosophy should be one of those co-present with English. But however beneficial criticism and advice from that department, and the possibility or probability of criticism may be, it seems to me in the highest degree unlikely that philosophic criticism or advice will bring me to see Marjorie Green as mischievously fallacious, or, for my purpose, anything but irreplaceable. I read on to the part you don't have yet, just because it was finishing a sentence. Okay. It may be deduced from the tone of this that Marjorie Green's book differs fundamentally from the history of Western philosophy by Bertrand Russell. Deduced from the tone. The tone of that quote was somewhat harsh, somewhat extreme, somewhat caricatured. When she says the wholly objective statements of science against the impassioned utterances of the arts, which are not statements at all. She is making very explicit and very dramatic the dichotomy which perhaps the science people might like to soft pedal. They might say, well, we don't consider this wholly objective, and we don't consider that the arts have nothing to say. In other words, Marjorie Green is making it more extreme. Her tone suggests that she thinks this is stupid. She disagrees strenuously, and she's mocking it. She's making fun of it. So, it can be deduced from this mocking tone that Marjorie Green's book differs fundamentally from the history of Western philosophy of Bertrand Russell. Now again here he is using understatement. It can be deduced from her tone that her book differs fundamentally. Well, yeah, her book says the opposite. Okay? So it doesn't just differ fundamentally, it flat out contradicts it. The history of Western philosophy, whose basic assumptions about the nature of objectivity, confirm the confidence so patent in Andreski that his own need no defense. Okay, we're back to Levis with his complicated grammatical structure in his sentence. No more simple, straightforward Marjorie Green. So, let's see. It may be deduced from the tone that this book differs from the history of Western philosophy. Whose basic assumptions? Okay, the basic assumptions of the history of Western philosophy, so of that book. Or it could be the basic assumptions of Bertrand Russell. Either way, it's going to be one and the same. The basic assumption is this Cartesian Newtonian dualism. Okay, so the basic assumptions about the nature of objectivity. So Bertrand Russell and the history of Western philosophical thought have the dualistic idea that objectivity is over here, subjectivity is over here, and the purity of science depends on the extrusion of any values from the objective. This is their basic assumption. These basic assumptions confirm the confidence so patent in Andreski. Patent means obvious and just unexamined because it's just clearly there. So the confidence, Andreski has confidence that his own assumptions need no defense because Bertrand Russell rests so strongly on his assumptions that they are just considered unassailable. This assumption of Bertrand Russell is rock solid. This Newtonian Cartesian dualism is so rock solid that you don't even have to look down to make sure you're on solid ground. Andreski is completely convinced that his assumptions need no defense. They're the same as Bertrand Russell's, which is what we've been talking about. So, it may be deduced from the tone of this that Marjorie Green's book differs fundamentally from the history of Western philosophy by Bertrand Russell, whose basic assumptions about the nature of objectivity confirm the confidence so patent in Andreski that his own assumptions, Andreski's, need no defense. Remember he said that Andreski isn't thinking real clearly, he has inconsistency, because he never examined his assumptions. Okay. I mention the history of Western philosophy because I have known experienced and energetic students, men of serious senior status attending my seminars, who, having prescribed for themselves a better acquaintance with that background of philosophic thought, which they have realized to be an essential element in literary history, had, they confessed, embarked on a perusal of at least immediately relevant stretches of Russell's large volume. Let's find the essential core sentence first. All right. I mention this book because I have known people who embarked on a perusal of the book. Okay, so the real core using different words is I mention this book because I have known good men who actually read it, actually began to read it. I'll just say actually read it. I believe that is the core sentiment. I mention this book because, in other words, I mentioned this terrible book because I have known people who actually read the thing. And I don't want the same to happen to you. I mention this because you might have actually tried to read this or be about to try to read it. You may be thinking of reading it. Don't. It's no good. That's the idea. So let's see, how does he achieve this with this sentence? Okay, I mentioned the history of Western philosophy. I mentioned the book. Because I have known, now I've said I have known good men. Good men. But what he actually says is, I have known experienced and energetic students, men of senior status, attending my seminars. Okay, I summarize that as good men for whom I have respect. Excellent men. Okay, but what they actually are is experienced and energetic students. A student is experienced if he is mature. He's not young, he's not a child, he's an adult who has been around the block a few times. That's an idiom in English that means you have experienced things and you know what you're doing. So, experienced and energetic students. So these are people who are not likely to make a mistake and people who are willing to work very hard. Energetic students who are proactive. This is the best kind of student. An experienced student who won't make a mistake, an energetic student who will put forth the effort and initiative to go out and get what he needs. Self-motivated, self-driven. So, I have known experienced and energetic students, men of senior status, attending my seminars. So, men of senior status, in other words, important men, men who have achieved a high degree of status in whatever field they're in, who are attending my seminar. So I'm speaking and they're in the audience. Who? Here's the who. All that was under good men. I have known good men. Who? Having prescribed for themselves a better acquaintance with that background of philosophic thought which they have realized to be an essential element in literary history. Okay, so this who is followed by a very long clause describing the people. Okay, so what kind of people are these people? What have they done? They have prescribed for themselves. Okay, when a doctor gives you a prescription, he is telling you what to do to fix your problem. When you prescribe something for yourself, you look at a problem and you formulate a plan to fix your problem. These people have prescribed for themselves a better acquaintance with the background of philosophical thought. A better acquaintance means they need to know more. So they have decided that they've got a problem. They are not familiar enough with the background of philosophic thought, which they have realized to be an essential element in literary history. So they see that if they're trying to study literature and become broadly familiar with the continuum of the living principle of living literature, they must understand the background of philosophical thought that was common in the day when the literature was produced. So they say, okay, I can't just study literature, I have to also become familiar with the philosophic history. So they said, I have a problem. I am not familiar with it. I need a better acquaintance with philosophic history. So how will I fix my problem? I have prescribed for myself to read Bertrand Russell's The History of Western Philosophy. Okay? So, they prescribed for themselves a better acquaintance with the background of philosophical thought, which they have realized to be an essential element in literary history. Okay, so these people who were that kind of person had actually, they confessed, embarked on a perusal. Okay, they had embarked. Okay, so I'm going to change this. Men who I have known good men who had embarked on a perusal. Okay, they confessed that they had embarked on a perusal. All right, had embarked means in the past they had begun. Embarked comes from sailing. It means to take off in a boat. Okay? To get on the boat and take off. So they had basically begun the journey of reading the relevant sections, at least, of Bertrand Russell's large book. So they weren't going to read the whole thing, but at least the relevant stretches, the portions of the book relevant to the literary history they were studying. So, I mention this book because I have known good men who, they confessed, had embarked on a perusal of at least immediately relevant stretches. Immediately relevant means just the ones that are relevant to the specific period of literature they're studying. So, immediately relevant stretches of Russell's large volume. And it says they confessed implies something they were embarrassed to say, oh yes, I'm doing it. They weren't proud. They didn't boldly proclaim, I'm reading Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophic Thought. Rather, they confessed, oh yes, I'm reading it. They confessed it. Why were they not proud? Because the word confessed registers the fact that they came out with this avowal in response to my telling a group of people in their position, my telling a group that people in their position hadn't time to discover for themselves how little the energy spent on Russell's history could bring them of the insight, understanding, and stimulus to thought that they needed. Okay, so we're into the next sentence now. I mention this book because I have known good men who confessed that they had embarked on a perusal of the immediately relevant stretches of Bertrand Russell's very large book. The confessed registers the word confessed registers the fact. Registers the fact that they came out with this avowal. When you come out with something, it's revealing something all of a sudden which you kept hidden before. And we talk about gay people coming out. They had hidden their gayness, now they're coming out. Something you're maybe ashamed of. So, the word confessed registers the fact that they came out with this avowal. The avowal is the statement that, yes, I am reading that bad book. That they came out with this avowal in response to my telling a group that people in their position hadn't time to discover for themselves how little the energy spent on Russell's history could bring them of the insight, understanding, and stimulus to thought they needed. Let me try to reduce the sentence to a core. They confessed that they were reading it in response to my telling them that they hadn't time for it. Okay. They confessed in response to my telling them that they did not have time for it. Hadn't is had not time. And really we would say they didn't have time. Didn't have time means you should not do it because it is not your business. You have other things more important to do. Your priorities are such that you cannot afford to waste time on this thing. And so after he finished telling the group that men in their position did not have time to waste on Bertrand Russell, then they confessed. Oh yes, I did it. I've read it. Okay, so let's look at how he achieves this meaning. The word confessed registers the fact. Okay, it is a fact that they confessed in response to his comments about the book. The fact that they came out with this avowal, that's confessing, in response to my telling a group that people in their position, i.e., students of literature, hadn't time to discover for themselves how little the energy spent on Russell's history could bring them. Okay, they didn't have time to discover for themselves how little the energy would bring them. Okay, so they hadn't time to discover for themselves how worthless this endeavor really was. The energy spent on Russell's history would bring them very little, would not bring them insight and understanding and stimulus to thought that they needed. So they want to study literature, they want to have insight, they want to understand what the author is really saying so that they can experience with the author and live with the author. So in order to gain this insight, they need to understand the terminology and the concepts of philosophy which pervade the worldview of the author. However, all of that is not going to help. If you get it from Bertrand Russell, you're going to be digging in the wrong place. Your energy will be misplaced. You will not receive the help you need. So that's what it means. Insight, understanding, and stimulus to thought. Stimulus to thought meaning when you understand the philosophy, it will cause you to think about the things in the literature and get even new creative ideas. Of course, as I told my seminars, The Knower and the Known, a much smaller book, gets its coherence, and with this its pregnancy and effective range, by having for its directing and informing spirit the profound conviction expressed in the introduction, the conviction that the Cartesian-Newtonian dualism must be exorcised from the Western mind. Another long sentence. Of course, as I told my seminars, The Knower and the Known, that's the title of the Marjorie Green book that we just have been sampling chapter 6 of. The Knower and the Known, which is a much smaller book, so it's easier to read than Bertrand Russell, takes less energy, and it will give you back more. Gets its coherence. Coherence is what holds it all together. So it gets its coherence from an idea which is an organizing theme. Okay? Gets its coherence. And with this, its pregnancy and its effective range. Okay? Because it all holds together, you can understand every part of it, even the parts that range out to other topics. And pregnancy means riches. Okay? So it gets its coherence, and with it its pregnancy and effective range, by having for its directing and informing spirit the profound conviction expressed in the introduction. So the dominating theme which holds it all together is this idea expressed in the introduction, namely that the conviction that the Cartesian-Newtonian dualism must be exorcised from the Western mind. I want to tell you that when I was speaking to Olavo about these paragraphs, and he was saying that this Cartesian-Newtonian dualism is all wrong, I could hardly believe it, because it is so entrenched in my way of thinking. I've been taught all my life in all subjects these kinds of distinctions, mind and matter and all this, and to give science respect for being objective, and to believe that the more social science stuff is subjective, culturally relative. Values are relative. Morality is relative. If it's okay for you, it's okay. It's not okay for me, it's not okay. A politician says, I'm against abortion, but I wouldn't put that on you. You know, all of this is so ingrained that I said to Olavo, if you attack Descartes and Galileo, you will be crucified. No one will take you seriously. And he said, you would be surprised. For the last 100 years, philosophers have been showing forth the absurdity of this, and it is now being challenged widely by the philosophers. But of course, at the lower levels of the teaching of science to more elementary students, they're still teaching from the dualistic worldview, uncritically. So, Marjorie Green and Levis and Marjorie Green are forerunners and early people debunking this whole worldview. And Olavo is also in this enterprise of trying to get people to quit thinking this way. And as Olavo says, he wants people to understand that they are a soul with a body. They are not a body, which maybe will have a soul one day after death if we're lucky. Maybe. Olavo says people think we are bodies, but really we are souls. and the secondary characteristics are real, and the so-called primary ones are derived by human intellect and arbitrarily set up according to standards imagined by man that don't have any independent existence. So that which is invisible is more real than that which is visible. Okay, we're going to stop there. We will pick up in the middle of the paragraph next time. I'll mark it. We only have about 6 more lines of this PDF. Hopefully by next week you'll have another PDF. If there are any questions, send them now. We'll wait for 5 minutes, and if there are no questions, I'll come back on and say goodbye. But if you have anything to say, send it in right now. Right.
I didn't get it. Could you repeat the explanation?
Yeah. Okay. The first question is, the student said that I used an idiomatic phrase for experienced students. The idiom was around the block. I don't have the board anymore, so I can't write it down. But a block is a portion of the street in a city where you walk until you can turn, and then you turn and walk until you can turn, and then you turn and you walk until you can turn, and then you turn and you walk until you can turn. So you make a big square, and that square is called a block, a city block. If you go around the block, which means you have walked the square a few times, you will have experiences. You will maybe run into somebody who does drugs and tries to sell you drugs. Maybe you will run into a prostitute who tries to solicit you for sex. Maybe you will run into a place where you can go into the library and learn books. Or maybe there will be a movie theater and you can see things. Or any number of things can happen. Maybe you will see a murder. Or maybe you will see the President of the United States drive by. Many things will happen to you as you walk around a city block. So, if someone has been around the block a few times, it means they are broadly experienced, usually in a more worldly manner. Okay, second question.
Second question. Another student asks about an expression that you used some classes ago. She says that you, talking about Andreski, you refer to Andreski's bedrock assumptions, and at least that's what she understood from what you said, and she would like you to explain what bedrock assumptions are, especially the expression bedrock.
The question is, several classes ago, I used a phrase referring to Andreski's bedrock assumptions. Again, if I had the board, I would write it. Bed is B-E-D. It's like something you sleep in. Rock is R-O-C-K. It means a stone. Put them together, bedrock has a geological meaning. Now, I am not a geologist, so I'm not sure about the technical meaning, but my understanding is that when you drill down into the earth, eventually you come to a place that is called bedrock. And this is a very hard layer that exists underneath the soil. And if you want to sink down a pole to support something, and you sink it all the way down to bedrock, then whatever you are supporting, maybe a house, will not sink further because it rests upon bedrock. It will never move. It cannot sink any further. So a bedrock assumption is an idea that is at the absolute bottom. It depends on nothing else. It is the starting place of your thought. And there is nothing underneath that undergirding it. It doesn't derive from anything else. It is the most basic stable assumption you've got. And for Andreski, possibly this Newtonian Cartesian dualism is a bedrock assumption that he doesn't question, he rests fully on, never expecting it to be questioned.
There's a third question.
Another question.
This student has been copying from a book, and there is an expression that he doesn't understand from this book. So he quotes two sentences, which are, Kate and Julia came toddling down the dark stairs at once. Both of them kissed Gabriel's wife. Both of them said she must be perished alive, and asked was Gabriel with her. He doesn't understand what she must be perished alive means in this context. And yeah, that's it.
All right, the student is copying, and he quoted a couple of sentences which Alessandro read to me. And in the sentences, a phrase was used that the student didn't understand. It was talking about two girls, little girls or young girls, who came up to a woman and kissed her on the cheek, greeted her, kissed her, and said, "Oh, you poor thing, you must be perished alive. Come in," or something like that. And he wondered, what is the meaning of the phrase perished alive? Now, perish is P-E-R-I-S-H, perish. It usually means to die. If you perish, you die. In this context, to be perished alive, first of all, it is archaic. You read this sort of thing in old books. It's not in common usage now. But what it means is you look like you are hungry, thirsty, and tired, almost to death. In other words, maybe you've had a long trip and you haven't slept in days, and you didn't get to wash, and you didn't get to eat or drink. You must be perished. It's almost like you're starving. You could say, "Oh, I'm starving." That's almost like dying by hunger. Well, to be perished alive is to basically be tired to death, hungry, fatigue, thirst. Usually it's used after a trip or after somebody goes through some kind of a difficult experience. Anything else?
No, that's
Okay, that's it for today. Keep up the copying. I like to hear that you are copying and coming across interesting phrases. And look online for the PDF to show up in a few days, the new PDF. Maybe you can read ahead. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.